The China Report for Monday, June 17, 2013. Credit crunch looms for China. China's credit boom could well be unprecedented, even in an era of massive debt binges. And day by day, it's looking ever more vulnerable. China reignited growth in the wake of the financial crisis by pumping vast amounts of credit into the economy through its banking system. This worked to get China growing again as the rest of the world ground to a halt. But it also set up some longer-term problems. Much of the credit went into expanding industrial capacity or into speculative real estate projects. The result now is that Chinese property prices are overinflated and can only be maintained by ever larger infusions of cheap credit, while Chinese industry is only being kept afloat through massive subsidies. The country has huge overcapacity problems across Chinese industry. One academic analysis estimates that subsidies account for 30% of Chinese industrial output. Most of the companies we looked at would probably be bankrupt without subsidies. Banks have been happily rolling over debts that in all likelihood won't ever be repaid. And the economy is rapidly reaching the limits to which ever more credit expansion can keep the system going. For one thing, the subsidized credit isn't free. It comes at a cost to Chinese households, which are forced to bear losses in real terms on savings that generate below-inflation yields. It would take a dramatic shift to rebalance the economy away from investment, which makes up an unparalleled 50% of GDP growth, towards domestic demand. Chinese household demand made up 34% of the economy in 2011. It's risen only slightly since, against 53% for South Korea, 63% for Vietnam and 56% for Thailand. Household consumption tends to make up between 60% and 70% of developed economy outputs. Japan's at the low end, the US at the high. China orders firms to curb pollution. The Chinese government has ordered firms in heavy polluting industries to cut emissions by 30% by 2017. Under the new rules, companies will be legally obliged to improve their pollution control equipment and will be penalized for excess emissions. Analysts said enforcement of the targets was likely to fall to local governments. The announcement did not specify which industries would be affected by the new emissions rules. However, earlier this year ministers hinted that industries such as iron, steel, petrochemicals and cement would face new targets. China has seen scores of environmental protests. Moving 250 million into cities. China is pushing ahead with a sweeping plan to move 250 million rural residents into newly constructed towns and cities over the next dozen years, a transformative event that could set off a new wave of growth or saddle the country with problems for generations to come. The government, often by fiat, is replacing small rural homes with high-rises, paving over vast swaths of farmland and drastically altering the lives of rural dwellers. So large is the scale that the number of brand-new Chinese city dwellers will approach the total urban population of the United States in a country already bursting with megacities. This will decisively change the character of China, where the Communist Party insisted for decades that most peasants, even those working in cities, remain tied to their tiny plots of land to ensure political and economic stability. Now, the party has shifted priorities, mainly to find a new source of growth for a slowing economy that depends increasingly on a consuming class of city dwellers. The shift is occurring so quickly, and the potential costs are so high, that some fear rural China is once again the site of radical social engineering. Over the past decades, the Communist Party has flip-flopped on peasants' rights to use land, giving small plots to farm during 1950 Southland reform, collectivizing a few years later, restoring rights at the start of the reform era, and now trying to obliterate small landholders. That's the China Report for today. Zaijian.